I'm going to stick with my time, so before I read the part of my presentation I have, let me just show you the summary. Well, this is a presentation outline. Let me go to the summary and then come back to this. Because some people may have to get up, go to the bathroom, I may talk too long, anything may happen, I want you to know what I was going to talk about. The important points of this presentation is know who you are. Know what zone you are in. Know that this is a war. Know the strategy, develop the tactics, and fortify Pan-African power. Now let's go back to the beginning. Okay, this is my very ambitious outline. I don't think I'm going to get through it, but at least you know the summary. So if I don't, you can see the continuation of this presentation probably at the MKA Institute or somewhere on the DIOP Institute's webpage. So let me begin. Okay, not too fast, but I'll try to do it, okay. Oh, by the way, at the end of it, I also have an explanation of what an independent Pan-African institution for education at a higher level would be like. That's only if we make it there, though, okay? So I'll set it up. First, I want to give background. The impetus for a chapter that I am writing about this comes from the inspiration of three notable 20th century Africans. They are the foremost Pan-African statesman, Kwame Nkrumah, who lived from 1909 to 1972, the skillful African strategist, Sékou Touré, who lived from 1922 to 1984, and the brilliant African Renaissance scholar, CHEIKH, who lived from 1923 to 1986. In one manifestation, all of these people still live with us. Each of these remarkable persons sought to build and enhance liberated zones of Pan-African activity. Each of them sought to empower the African masses and to improve the quality of life for each African. Nkrumah and Touré were both presidents of African states in West Africa. Touré and Diop were both African Muslims that experienced French colonialism in West Africa. Nkrumah and Diop both received degrees of higher education abroad and worked as academicians. Collectively, they crafted a corpus of literature that is required reading by any serious Pan-African scholar. This chapter that I'm writing, however, focuses on one particular portion of their writings, liberated areas. Nkrumah, Touré, and Diop published their works during a period of extraordinary activity by Pan-African forces. In the 1960s alone, the majority of African states declared their independence from European imperial centers. The 1970s through the 1980s would see the remainder of the states achieve their independence, albeit through armed warfare. Imperialist organizations and state institutions did not, however, resign themselves to failure. They regrouped. They modified their approach to facilitate their continued extrapolation of African resources and exploitation of African labor. The need to change methods in order to maintain profits was set early in the catastrophe of the international war between competing imperial gangs, often called World War II, between 1939 and 1945. The war caused chaos and destruction throughout Europe, the United States of America, Asia, and Africa. At the end of the war, finance capitalists, in cahoots with their muscle, the USA military, led the capitalist reconstruction of Europe. Europe's grip on its colonies, however, was weakened by two prime factors. First, the colonized subjects witnessed the vulnerability of the European powers. Colonial powers armed colonized subjects and used them to fight Europeans. That experience reduced the sense of the colonizers' omnipotence over the colonized. Secondly, oh, by the way, what that means is Africans found out Europeans could die if you shot them.
That's right.
So, and that they wouldn't necessarily just resurrect. That experience reduced the sense of the colonizers' omnipotence. I said that. Secondly, the European nations were exhausted and vastly weakened, and that reduced their ability to resist the increasingly popular liberation movements. Asian and African organizations set about liberating their populations from the direct control of European states. For Africa, the dominant leadership came from its Pan-African formations. In 1945, a Pan-African conference held in Manchester, England, was co-convened by W.B. Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah. Du Bois addressed the conference urging the colonial powers to release their control of their colonies. Nkrumah, on the other hand, addressed the colonized subjects and urged them to throw off the colonial yoke through organized activity. There was general agreement at the conference that the delegates would seek the soonest opportunity to return to their homeland and prosecute movements for liberation. The opportunity to do this had presented itself while Europe was being reconstructed and not yet fully able to pacify its colonies. Nevertheless, the colonial forces had a wild card in their arsenal, and that wild card was soon to come into play. You see, pacification was not limited to the force of arms. The end goal of imperial strategy was to win the hearts and minds of the colonial population, beginning with the intellectuals and professionals, you and me. These intellectuals and professionals, once their appetites were piqued, would deliver the colony and its natural resources and the labor of its population securely into the fold of the empire. Pan-Africanists had an appetite, however, for independence and renaissance through Pan-African unity. Such an appetite endangered the imperial momentum to pacify and conquer. In some cases, English colonists were caught by surprise and had to adjust to this reality after the fact. French colonists saw the writing on the wall and moved rapidly to enlist those African elites that were addicted to French culture and hoist them up as leaders of African independence in Francophone colonies. Independence achieved by African states in the 1950s and 60s, thanks to the crafty entrenchment of European imperialists, was often benign. Most African states acquired and then stubbornly clung to what is called sham independence. According to Nkrumah, sham independence was established by imperialists in an attempt to arrest the progress of the people's movement through a betrayal of its essential objectives. The essential objectives that Nkrumah referred to were 1, mass empowerment, 2, continental unity, and 3, scientific socialist development of the African economy. He writes this on page 26 through 29 in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. African nationalists sought political independence formulaically to redirect economic development of the ex-African colonies. There was another element to the formula, however, that got away from the African leadership of many of these nation states. Those leaders did not listen to Nkrumah's declared theme of Pan-African interdependence as a basis for African independence. A critical mass of African nation states chose binding relationships with economic interests representing former imperial forces rather than other African nation states. It was a matter of time, just a matter of time, before the economies of the so-called independent African nations were retethered to the global capitalist economy, and the lion's share of vast profits vacated Africa and streamed to capitals and capital usurpers based in the former imperial centers. The biggest losers in these neo-colonial relations were the African workers and peasants, and tragically, the African elite that collaborated with the imperial usurpers was the African intelligentsia, especially military officers trained in Europe or American military institutes. Members of this African intelligentsia were walking contradictions, reflecting self-negating interests and activity that was counterintuitive. The premeditated development of the intelligentsia's appetites led to its suicidal tendencies. Arresting these tendencies requires focus and repair on the preparatory institutions of the intelligentsia. Now stop reading at that point. This is what drove my questions earlier today to the to the schools that we were talking to. These are the institutions that prepare our intelligentsias. And the enemy, because they seek to win and constantly control the resources of Africans and the labor of Africans, only uses the military as the prick of a needle. The real serum that they use to lull us to sleep is their curriculum and their education. Which is why when I deal with liberated zones and trying to enhance this, I want to take this to a further step than what Nkrumah and Ture and what DIOP proposed earlier on, because now we've had some experience in this sham independent era. So with that, let me just move forward in these slides very quickly. I have like 20 of them. I'm going to show them in 10 minutes, maybe even 5 minutes. Let's see. Okay. We did the summary, and by the way, these are bibliography for those of you who want to follow up on this yourself. You should read Africa Must Unite by Nkrumah, also Class Struggle in Africa and Neocolonialism, Last Stage of Imperialism, both by Nkrumah. Dark Days in Ghana, when the elite in Ghana helped to overthrow the revolutionary experiment. And finally, well, not finally, but also Revolutionary Path, in which there's a clear definition of liberated zones in the military style and geopolitical style. And then Revolutionary Path, which was published after Nkrumah's death. Also, United States of Africa, a very hard book to find, which I'm in the process of reproducing and putting a forward on, written by CHEIKH. The cultural unity of Black Africa, very important 14 points in the back of it that talks about what you need to liberate and have a liberated area inside of Africa. Then also the Green Book. Some of you may have forgot all about that because they shot Gaddafi down, but they shot him down once he declared Africa as his main interest. All that other stuff before, they were building it up, but once he started going around wearing African clothes and talking about Africa should drop Europe connection and putting up the first African satellite, they said, oh, you got to go. And here we can see that Time had a plan for each of these men and put them all on their cover. Anyway, as we start to enhance the liberated zones and the zonal analysis, we should enhance our understanding of what Pan-Africanism is. It means the total liberty of Africa and Africans, total unity of Africa and Africans, continental-wide socialist organization, and mass political and economic control. Total liberation from foreign economic, political, psychological, cultural, and military control, antiquated identities, social practices, and modes of production that cause internal disunity and alienation, scientific and technical retardation. Total unity, meaning organizing global revolutionary political entity, organizing of local revolutionary authorities and basic political committees and congresses throughout Africa. And 3, African-wide political and military organization and cultural organization. And the last 2 points under Pan-Africanism are production. When we talk about continental-wide socialist organization, we mean production and distribution oriented for the improvement of the African people, promotion of popular planned economy, and prevention of capitalist development and eradication of it where it exists. By the way, that last one was the idea mentioned in DIOP's book. And then mass political and economic control, increased popular access to self-conscious Pan-African culture, development of cross-continental communication and transportation, and 3, horizontal development of political and economic authority. These are established ideas already. This is not yet getting to the kind of zonal development that's necessary for the intelligentsia to keep us from being corrupted and being our own enemies. We'll get to that in a second. Anyway, in terms of the general zonal analysis, we see that liberated zone is the optimal zone of African agency, and an enemy-held zone is the retarded zone of African agency, and in between the two are forward and contesting zones. Now, Nkrumanist analysis said that the way that the African population was made up primarily of workers and peasants who make the real wealth of Africa, but it was the intelligentsia, specifically a certain segment of the intelligentsia, that should be involved in the leading the revolutionary movement. He said the 3rd section of the intelligentsia to emerge after independence consists of revolutionary intellectuals, those who provide the impetus and leadership of the worker-peasant struggle for all-out socialism. Role of the Pan-African intelligentsia, these are minimal assumptions. The Pan-African intelligentsia is the spark of the Pan-African revolution. Capitalism is antithetical to African unity, and African liberation requires African unity. So you can put the pieces together about capitalism. Okay? And here we need to advance even this concept. Agency is first and foremost the self-conscious active character of the people in its multidimensional growth and development. And I'm raising this because when you do review and try to find out agency, once you leave the Afrocentric discussion, you'll see that only psychology deals with agency, and they usually deal with it with the unit of measure being the individual. But, and as a result, most of our education that are in these educational curriculums focus primarily on the individual as the unit of analysis for all activity. Matter of fact, they believe that the people are the result of some individuals coming together and saying, why don't we be a people? When in fact, it's the reverse that's more than likely true. The people are best understood dimensionally through these various dimensions. There may be more dimensions, but these are the ones I could find in time for my presentation. Life, time, space, ideology, biology, aesthetics, science, material production, and organization. Again, there may be more. This is not an exclusive list. But one thing, if you're talking about improving and enhancing the people's momentum, you have to understand how to see the people. So let's graph it just a little bit here. The people. The macro identity of our species. First of all, life is at the center. And this is why the Ankh is still probably the longest known sign of our spiritualism is the Ankh. Life is the center of the people. But life moves through time and space, which are both relative to each other. And at the same time, human beings and the people are, first of all, biology, I shouldn't even have to define that or explain that at all. But ideology is just as important to life for humans as biology is. Then these things give rise to science and aesthetics, and they themselves give rise to material production and organization. Altogether, these things are the people, and these things, in fact, represent the culture, human culture. That's just a graph of it. Now I'm gonna run through these next slides real quick. You know, just look at them. I'm even just gonna say the words. I'm not even gonna explain them, I think, too much. When I say living manifestation, I'm talking about birth, childhood, prime, maturity, transition, afterlife, divinity. When I'm talking about temporal manifestation, the ancestors, the elders, the youth, the yet to be born. Spatial, earthlings, Africans, Asians, Americans, individuals, all kinds of smaller communities. Ideological, spiritual speculation, philosophy, ontology, axiology, epistemology, ethics, identity. I'm sure there's some I missed. Biological, of course, the species, the clan, the family, the person, every aspect of the human species that are required in order for the continuation and biological manifestation and generation. The aesthetic, beautification, wisdom, intuition, common sense, rhythm, prophecy, harmonic intonation, and sensory modification. And all of that really precedes the scientific, which is testing, assessing, evaluating, theorizing, categorizing, hypothesizing, calculating. The people finally in its organizational manifestation encompasses international states, nation states, regional states, local municipalities, economic institutions, cultural, spiritual, and civic institutions. And finally, in the material production, the people manifest technique, technology, skill, labor, craft, transport, cultivation, and harvesting. There are more, but I wanted to get to the zones. Now, these are the three basic zones we're talking about. Enemy held, contested, and revolutionary, and we want to get to revolutionary. However, most of us work in institutions that reflect enemy held. Don't get it twisted. Know who you are and where you are. Because if you don't, you'll be doing the wrong thing in the wrong place and get iced. Okay? Just know. Thank you. Good. Thank you much. And now, ideology involves these things. I don't need to talk about that anymore. Oh, but one thing about ideology we should say. People talked about this whole sense of universalism. If this was Eurocentric, hegemonic focus, the European cultural values of the upper class and ruling class is imposed as a normalcy, and their standards of excellence are imposed as universal norms and standards. But it's in these areas in which they do that. It's important for us to know that, because if we're going to counter it, we know that these are the areas where we must struggle to free ourselves from the control of enemy forces. Now, this speaks for itself. That sign is coming closer. Boom. AFRICOM. I was in a presentation recently last year. A sister came out of Nigeria, a Pan-Africanist sister was up on my campus, and she was arguing with some of her brothers out of Nigeria, and they were telling her Pan-Africanism's unreal. And she says, well, America thinks it's real because why do we have to wait to America to organize the unity of Africa? And they're doing that under AFRICOM. Do you know what AFRICOM is? You should really look up AFRICOM. AFRICOM is this real military plan. You know, Nkrumah and Ture and all of them, DIOP said all foreign bases should be off of the African continent. And matter of fact, Gaddafi kicked off foreign bases when he first came to power. Right now, under our current half-European president of America, we have African military bases all over, American military bases all over Africa. And they're run by African elites, intelligentsia, who have been convinced that the European way of life is the best way to go and that Americanization of Africa is what they need to do. So be careful when you say you're an African American, because you may be talking about Americanizing Africa. European-centered hegemonic things, these are the ways you need to look at it today. I'm not going to spend time with this because I do want to spend my last 2 minutes reading what the independent institution was like. Oh, I can't just talk about African-centered zones because you need to know that European-centered zones, for Africans, this would be called enemy-held. For European-centered, this is called hegemonic. But they can change also because they're part of the human family, but their change would be transitional, and finally, at some point, maybe even revolutionary. But if they were in their transitional stage, they would have tolerance for non-European culture and societies and societal introspection and debate about the best future, meaning that they would look at themselves and realize them running things may not be the best thing. And if they become revolutionary, they'll reform the historical narrative, just like we've been telling them to reform it, and they would also assert people's rights and human rights. And they would support anti-hegemonic mass movements. And they would advocate voluntary international integration of peoples. And if you want to know if they're revolutionary, do you see that right now in your institution? That's not happening, is it? So probably more than likely in the hegemonic phase. Summary, here it is again. Know who you are, know what zone you are in, know that this is a war, know the strategy, develop tactics, fortify African power. And now just a little bit of icing on the cake, let me just talk about what a real revolutionary, liberated, higher educational institution would be like.
Yes.
Okay. A, it would be a pro-Pan-African curriculum that would be secured through administrative mandate or through a faculty and student movement representing the majority of the campus under the leadership of an anti-imperialist and well-organized Pan-Africanist program. B, a vulgar, yeah, right. B, a vulgar careerist curriculum would be replaced by a human-centric curriculum. C, a pedagogical revolution would take place to consolidate Pan-African curricula by promoting accelerated literacy, numeracy, and technical skills, improving learning habits and research abilities, establishing ideological freedom from dependence on foreign economic appetites and assumptions. D, constructive creativity would be achieved as a result of peer discussion and debates within the Pan-African program. E, there would be steady progress to transform theory into practice by participating in practicums designed by the Pan-African program. And these practicums would provide opportunities at the global level, continental level, and local level. F, there would be constant assessment, checking, and rechecking of the program outcomes. G, the advanced disciplinary study of political economy would be a required part of the curriculum as general education. Such a study would review historical and contemporary models of governance, evaluate models of governance according to the goals of the objectives of Pan-Africanism, offer creative models of governance that consider technological developments, provide internships with Pan-African political organizations like the MKA Institute. H, revolutionary liberation movements in the contested zones of Africa would be examined and showcased with leading members of those movements, providing convocations to the institution's communities. I, organizational youth leaders and revolutionary practitioners of people's forces in the neo-colonial states, i.e. zones under enemy control or in contested areas, would be given scholarships to participate in a variety of programs offered by the institution. J, there would exist an organic liaison with other liberated academic institutions, especially those in other liberated zones of the African nation. Periodic conferences in person and online would be held. K, provision of resources and platforms for presentations from liberation movements, people's rights movements, and human rights movements. L, sponsorship of evaluative reports and up-to-date analyses of the anti-African aggression would be ongoing. M, regular periodic critical assessments would be held to guide programmatic improvements. N, the main criterion for judging liberated academic institutions is the actual direction in which they are moving, since this is of an assessment of a dynamic phenomena. And I'm gonna stop there so we can have discussion. Thank you for your time and focus.